In the quiet places of Asia, where prayers are older than stone, and shadows kneel where monks once chanted, there are stories we do not speak aloud. This is where they live. Welcome to Whispers of Asia, a channel where sacred silence meets forgotten horror. Here, the veil between the living and the lost is thinner, and every whispered prayer echoes through time, binding the living to the unburied and the unloved. Tonight, we follow a monk who dared to speak what should not have been spoken. A vow was broken, a chant was heard, and a soul that was never meant to return opened its eyes before dawn. This is the story of the Last Chant Before Dawn, a monk's forbidden prayer. Let the incense burn, let the silence deepen, and do not, under any circumstances, chant along.
The valley was silent long before the boy arrived. Nestled deep between two veils of mist-cloaked mountains, there stood a temple not marked on any map. It was not a tourist site, nor a destination for pilgrimage. It was a place of retreat, meant only for those who no longer wished to be found. The locals called it Wat Tom Sakorn, the Temple of the Still Cave. No one knew who built it. No one remembered when the last new monk had walked up its worn stone steps. And yet, every morning the bell rang once, as if the temple were exhaling after a long night of holding its breath. Anand arrived with the first fog of the cold season, carrying only a cloth satchel and a past too heavy for a boy of 17. His eyes were hollow but calm, the way a shoreline looks after a storm has taken everything. He did not speak much as he bowed before the main gate, 3 arches carved from dark stone, weathered and moss-bitten. The wooden doors creaked open not with force, but with familiarity, as if recognizing the sorrow in his chest. A welcome shaped like silence. A single monk greeted him, a man whose age could not be guessed. His robes were worn, patched in places with hand-stitched care. His eyes were deep, unreadable, like bowls of still water. "You've come to leave something behind," the monk said softly. Anand nodded. "We all do, at first." He did not ask what Anand's name was, or what sins followed him up the mountain path. He simply motioned for the boy to enter, and with that, the gates of Wat Tom Sakorn closed behind them. The days passed like the falling of ash, slow, silent, sacred. Anand woke before the sun, swept leaves that never stopped falling, and washed bowls for monks who rarely spoke more than a word or two. He learned the rhythm of things, when incense should be lit, which chant should begin the dawn, and how to lower his gaze when crossing the shadow of the stupa. But there was something different about this place. It wasn't just the quiet, it was a kind of hush beneath the silence, as if the temple itself were listening. Not waiting for answers, but waiting for someone to ask the right question. At night, Anand slept on a thin mat beneath the eaves of the old wooden hall. The monks did not allow novices to stay inside the main quarters. That space, they said, was reserved for those who have already forgotten the world. But he didn't mind. The cold kept his memories still. One night, however, as he pulled the blanket over his shoulders, he heard it. A chant, soft, measured, like a breath trembling through the crack in an old door. It wasn't the usual evening chant. This one was lower, older. It had a rhythm not taught in morning study. Anand sat up. It came from beyond the prayer hall, near the edge of the forest where no novices were allowed. It rose in cadence like a tide calling to the moon. Words he didn't understand, syllables that left a taste of burnt incense in the air. Then, a bell. but no one had rung the bell that night. When he asked about it the next morning, no one answered. The older monks simply told him, "Some sounds are not meant to be heard twice." He kept silent after that, but he listened harder. One afternoon, as he scrubbed the stone floor near the offering table, Anand noticed something beneath the altar cloth. A sliver of carved wood, an old blackened bead of a mala necklace, the kind used for mantras but cracked and scorched at one end. When he picked it up, the bead was warm. The moment his fingers touched it, a whisper brushed past his ear. Not quite words, but breath shaped like sorrow. He dropped it. Behind him, the head monk, the same one who greeted him, was watching. "You felt it, didn't you?" he said. Anand said nothing. The monk approached slowly, picked up the bead, and turned it over in his palm. "Not all prayers are meant to be answered," he murmured. "Some were never meant to be spoken at all." He paused, then added with a voice like wind through dry leaves, "When the dead ask for prayer, it is not always to be freed." That was the first time Anand heard his name, Venerable Samchai, the only monk who chanted after the sun had fallen. That night, Anand watched from a distance. Venerable Samchai stood beneath the Bodhi tree, silhouetted by the flicker of candlelight. His posture was still, palms pressed together, lips moving in quiet rhythm. The candle's flame bowed toward him as if in reverence. Anand thought he saw something behind the monk. A woman, thin, dressed in tattered white, face veiled with shadow. Her hands folded like she too was praying or begging. But when Anand blinked, there was only the tree, and a gust of wind that snuffed the candle in a single breath. Weeks passed. The chanting at night never stopped. Neither did Anand's dreams. He began waking at odd hours, always at 3:13. The number stayed in his mind like an echo. In his dreams, he walked barefoot down temple halls no longer standing. He lit incense sticks that hissed instead of smoke. He stood before a sealed stupa, from which came the sound of weeping, not from one voice, but many, all whispering the same name, Arya Chandra. He didn't know what it meant. But when he whispered it aloud in the meditation hall one evening, the walls trembled ever so slightly. And Venerable Samchai, who had just entered behind him, dropped his mala beads with a sharp gasp. "You must never say that name again," the monk said, not in anger, but in dread. Anand bowed low, apologizing. But the name stayed in his mouth like ash. One evening, Anand found himself at the edge of the old forest, where the trees grew thick and the ground softened into mist. He didn't remember walking there. The chanting had drawn him like a thread pulled through the eye of a needle. And then he saw it. A door. Old, wooden, built into the hillside. Around it were charms, thin parchment bound with red string, covered in ancient Pali script. A small bell hung on the handle, unmoving despite the wind. Anand reached for it. But before his fingers touched the door, a hand gripped his shoulder. Venerable Samchai. His face was pale, his voice low. "If you open that door," he said, "you will never dream of silence again." Anand lowered his hand, and for the first time, he understood. This temple was not simply a sanctuary. It was a prison. Not for the living, but for something that had once died and had never been allowed to go. The next morning, the bell rang 3 times. No one explained why, and no one asked, but Anand knew. A prayer had been heard, and soon it would begin again. There are chants taught with fire in the lamp, chants taught with breath, and then there are chants that are never taught at all, because to speak them is to open a door that must stay shut. Anand began to notice the absences before he noticed the signs. First, it was the silence in the chanting hall after evening meals, where once the monks would gather to recite the Metta Sutta or the Ratana Sutta. Now they sat in stillness, their mouths closed as if stitched shut by reverence or fear. Not all of them, perhaps, but enough to shift the rhythm of the temple's breath. Then came the missing verses. One morning, as Anand recited his daily practice, he paused. A gap lingered between two stanzas, one the teachers never explained, as though something had been cut from the scroll, yet the echo of its absence remained. When he asked one of the senior monks about it, the monk's response was flat, as if rehearsed. "There are prayers we do not carry. They carry us, and some carry us too far." That night, the chanting came again. This time, Anand did not resist. He followed the sound barefoot through the cool stone corridors, his breath tight in his chest, his heart beating in rhythm with the prayer he had never been taught. The voice belonged to Venerable Somchai, as it always did, but now Anand could make out words, ancient syllables folded around vowels that vibrated through the air like invisible bells. He pressed his ear against the thick door to the inner shrine. "Iti piso, Bhagava, Bimutinyana dasano, Tathagata araham samma sambuddho." But then the pattern shifted. The words stopped being words. They stretched, they unspooled, they wound backward like chants remembered by the dead. And then another voice joined him, higher, whisper thin, echoing beneath the floorboards of the world. Anand stepped back from the door. He had heard enough. The next morning he asked, not directly, not with the word forbidden on his lips. Instead, he approached Venerable Somchai during water offering, when the senior monk stood alone by the Bodhi tree, his palm pouring slow streams onto the roots of a past life. "I heard something last night," Anand began quietly. Somchai's hand did not stop pouring, but his gaze hardened. "There are many sounds in old wood, and many memories in stone. The temple sings in its own way. But the chant, it was yours, wasn't it? That chant is not part of any scripture we keep. It was born of intention, not instruction, and that is why it should never be spoken aloud." Anand swallowed. "Then why do you—" "Because I once believed that compassion was stronger than karma." The wind moved between them like an unseen spirit. Somchai looked down at the roots of the Bodhi tree, now dark with water. "I was wrong." Later that day, Anand found an old manuscript in the temple library, a bundle of palm leaf pages bound in red thread, half decayed and crumbling at the corners. It was not on the shelf. It had fallen behind one of the carved statues, as if hiding from time. The pages were strange. They bore chants familiar in tone but fractured in form, reversed lines, symbols in place of syllables, and ink that looked faintly rust-colored, like dried blood smeared with a monk's final breath. At the bottom of one page, he found a note written in a trembling hand. "To chant for the lost is mercy. To chant for the condemned is defiance. To finish the chant is death." He closed the manuscript. His hands shook. A monk saw him, raised a hand to warn him, but said nothing. No one dared touch the pages. That night, The chanting returned. This time it was louder, closer, coming from the direction of the stupa. The stupa was sacred ground, sealed since before Anand's birth. No one entered it, no one even swept near it. Offerings were left 5 steps away, never closer. But the chanting pulsed from within, like the heartbeat of something buried too soon. Anand stood outside it, barefoot on stone turned cold with moonlight. His lips moved, unconsciously, repeating the syllables he should not know. A light wind rustled the incense sticks nearby. One of them lit itself. And the moment he whispered the final syllable of the chant, the wind stopped. Time folded, and a voice, like silk dragged across a coffin lid, whispered from within the stupa. "You heard me." He turned and ran. The next day, he confronted Venerable Somchai once more. But this time, it was the monk who spoke first. "You've heard it now. You've begun." Anand nodded, his throat dry. "What is it? Who is it for?" "The chant," he said slowly, "is for a soul that cannot pass, one who died in violation of both dharma and intention, a soul that wants to be free but is not meant to be. And yet," he looked up, "there is a place between mercy and madness where compassion becomes a curse. I once went there." He closed his eyes, and for a long moment there was only the rustle of leaves above. "I heard her crying," he said, his voice lower now, "and I could not bear it." "Who?" Anand asked. Somchai opened his eyes. "You will know her name before dawn, but when you do, you must not say it back." That night, Anand did not sleep. He knelt in the meditation hall, candlelight flickering, malas coiled in his lap. And slowly the chant came to him again. But this time he answered. He spoke it softly, syllable by syllable, until the air around him grew dense and heavy. The candle flame bent low. The windows misted over, and just beyond the edge of the hall, near the veiled stupa, a figure stood watching. She did not move. She did not speak. But when Anand blinked, her mouth was already open, mouthing the last line of the chant that no one had ever dared to finish. And in the distance, the temple bell rang, once, then again, then fell silent.
The air inside the prayer hall always smelled of old incense, sweet, heavy, almost metallic. It clung to the lungs like memory, a fragrance that refused to fade. Anand swept the floor each morning after dawn, chanting, his movements slow and deliberate. But today, as the broom brushed along the corner of the altar, the bristles struck something solid, a small urn, hidden behind layers of dust and neglect. It was unmarked. No inscriptions, no prayers carved, only a thin string of faded gold wound tightly around its neck, tied with a knot so precise it looked ritualistic. Anand hesitated before touching it. The ceramic was warm beneath his fingers, as though it held a heart that still beat faintly. When he lifted it, something inside shifted, soft, like dry leaves moving in the dark. He brought it into the light. The ash shimmered faintly, as though refusing to stay dead. He called for one of the senior monks, but when they arrived and saw what he was holding, their expressions changed. No one spoke. One monk bowed his head deeply to the urn, then whispered, "That one is not to be moved." Anand blinked. "Whose ashes are these?" But the monk only backed away, chanting under his breath as he left the hall. That night, Anand returned alone. The rain had begun to fall, thin and steady,
drumming softly on the temple roof. He brought a candle, shielding the flame with his palm as he approached the urn again. He knelt and placed it before him. The flame flickered. The air thickened. He whispered softly, "Who are you?" For a long moment, there was only the sound of rain. Then something shifted inside the urn. The ash began to stir, swirling in a pattern too deliberate to be random. It formed faint lines, symbols he didn't recognize. And then, in the silence that followed, a voice brushed across his ear. "You heard the chant." He froze. The candle guttered. "He promised me release," the voice said again, faint, trembling, sorrowful. "But he left me in the smoke." Anand's heart pounded. The urn trembled as the whisper grew clearer, rising and falling like breath drawn through dust. "I burned for 3 nights, and the fire would not take me." The candle went out. By dawn, Anand had not slept. He went to Venerable Somchai as the morning bell echoed across the valley. The older monk sat alone under the Bodhi tree, his robes damp with dew. The moment he saw Anand's face, he knew. "You opened it," Somchai said quietly. Anand nodded. The old monk sighed, his breath leaving him like smoke from dying incense. "She spoke to you," Anand swallowed. "Yes, she said you promised her release." Somchai looked down at his trembling hands. "I did." He paused, then continued in a voice too soft to be confession, too burdened to be denial. "She was not meant to die within these walls. The temple forbids cremation for those who take their own lives, but I pitied her. I thought a prayer could cleanse what karma had condemned." His eyes lifted, hollow with memory. "I was wrong." Anand listened as Somchai told the story. Years ago, a woman came to the temple carrying her child's ashes in a small urn. She had lost everything, her husband to war, her home to fire. In despair, she ended her life within the temple grounds, beside the Bodhi tree, hoping her suffering would end where peace was supposed to begin. But by temple law, her soul was not to be chanted for. A suicide carried karmic weight too heavy for ordinary prayer. Somchai, moved by compassion, broke the law. He performed a private rite at midnight, chanting words that no monk had spoken in centuries, a prayer to sever the cycle of rebirth, a chant meant to free a suffering soul. But it did not free her. Instead, it bound her to the temple. When the cremation fire was lit, the flames recoiled, the wood hissed. For 3 nights the body burned, yet never turned to ash. In the end, the monk sealed what remained into that urn and buried it beneath the altar. The temple called it mercy. Somchai called it failure. As the story ended, a distant sound broke the silence. A bell, faint, muffled, echoing from inside the main hall. Anand and Somchai looked toward it, eyes meeting. Neither had rung it. They rushed inside. The altar was covered in ash. The urn had cracked open, a hairline fracture running down its center. From the fissure seeped thin wisps of gray smoke, curling like fingers reaching for prayer. And carved on the dust upon the floor, as if traced by invisible hands, was a single word. Arya Chandra. Anand stepped back. "That name," he whispered, "the one from my dream." Somchai's face went pale. He turned sharply, gripping the boy's shoulder. "You must not say it again. Every time her name is spoken, she awakens further." "But she's already awake," Anand said. "She spoke to me." Somchai's eyes darkened. Then the chant has begun again. That night, the temple refused to sleep. The monks gathered in the main hall, their voices trembling as they chanted protective sutras. The air vibrated with sacred sound, but underneath, Anand could hear something else. A second voice weaving between theirs, rising and falling in harmony, yet entirely separate. It was hers, Arya Chandra. She chanted the forbidden verse, the one that had been erased from the scriptures. Each repetition made the lamps flicker. The incense turned to black smoke. The monk's breath grew short, as if the temple itself were running out of air. Somchai raised his voice, shouting over the wind, "End the chant! End it before dawn!" But it would not stop. The walls trembled, the statues of the Buddha wept trails of soot, and from the open crack in the urn a face began to take form, ashen, veiled, trembling as though made of smoke and grief. Her voice, now clearer than the monk's, whispered, "You said I would cross. Why did you lie?" Somchai fell to his knees. I saw something in his eyes, regret, not fear. He bowed deeply, pressing his forehead to the ground. "I tried," Somchai whispered. "I truly did." The spirit's voice turned brittle. "Then chant again." She vanished. The urn fell silent. The air stilled. And in that silence, Somchai spoke the words Anand feared most. "If I begin again, she will not be the only one who rises." At dawn, the temple felt heavier, as though wrapped in unseen smoke. The monks whispered among themselves about the forbidden name, about how the chanting had changed the air. Birds no longer landed on the Bodhi tree. The leaves had begun to wilt, their veins darkened by something other than time. Anand looked toward the stupa, the sealed shrine where Somchai once broke his vow. It seemed to hum faintly, as if remembering. He did not know yet that the line between the dead and the living had already thinned, and that the next chant would no longer belong to a monk alone.
The stupa stood like a sealed throat of the mountain. It rose from the rear of the temple complex, away from the chanting halls, hidden behind a curtain of bamboo and stone. Unlike the prayer halls or Bodhi courtyard, no novices were ever assigned to clean merit. No incense was offered there. No birds nested in its crevices. It was a monument to silence. And yet, Anand could hear it humming, not with sound, but with memory. The chant came again, but this time it began inside his chest. He did not hear it, he felt it, a slow, rhythmic pull beneath his ribs, like invisible hands threading a prayer string through his breath. He rose from his mat, barefoot, lips dry. The temple was dark, save for the dim orange glow of an oil lamp flickering near the eastern gate. The others were asleep. Even the dogs in the lower forest had stopped barking. Everything held its breath, and Anand walked toward the stupa. The moon was thin tonight, no more than a sliver held gently between two clouds. The path was darker than usual. The bamboo arched overhead like praying hands. The scent of wet moss and ash filled the air. As he approached, he saw them, charms, ropes tied across the front of the stupa in thick layers, wax seals pressed into the stone like old scars, red strings knotted with bells, strips of parchment with ancient Pali written in hurried script. Some were so old the ink had bled into the wind. He stood before the sealed wooden door, his breath fogged in the air. Behind the door, a soft murmur, not words, just presence. And then, tap, a single knock from the inside. He stepped back, his heart pounding, but nothing happened. No voices, no movement, just the wind curling around the stupa, as if mourning something lost. He was about to leave when he saw it, scratched into the stone at the base. 1 chant before dawn. That is the price. The next day, the stupa was no longer sealed. The ropes had been cut, the red wax broken. 1 bell lay on the ground, cracked in half, and in the silence that followed, even the morning bell of the temple rang slower, as if unsure it should still be waking the day. Anand told no one what he saw, but Venerable Samchai did not need to ask. "You went to her," the monk said, staring into the steam of his morning tea. "She called," Anand whispered. "She always does, especially when someone has chanted the first line." Anand hesitated. "What's inside the stupa?" Samchai looked up. "My sin." Later that afternoon, the senior monk took Anand back to the stupa. They did not speak. Samchai carried incense and a single bowl of black rice. He stood before the door, placed the offerings down, and whispered a mantra Anand had never heard. The words were sharp. Each one struck the air like a hammer. Then he lit the incense, and the smoke curled not upward but sideways, drawn toward the door. Anand noticed a small circular hole carved near the base of the stupa, sealed by a screen of bone. Yes, bone. Delicately carved pieces, knuckle-sized and yellow with age, woven together like lattice. Behind it, darkness, the kind of darkness that has been watching for a long, long time. "She watches from there," Samchai said. Anand's mouth dried. "I thought the stupa was empty." "It was never empty," Samchai replied. "We just stopped listening." That night the dreams returned, only now they were no longer dreams. He stood in the stupa. He knew it, though he had never stepped inside. The walls were lined with robes, not folded, hanging, as if waiting to be worn again. The air smelled of burnt rice and something sweeter, something rotting beneath the sweetness, like perfume over a corpse. In the center sat a woman, veiled, unmoving, her back to him. Ash fell from her sleeves like snow. She chanted with her head bowed, not aloud, but into the bones beneath her. And around her were hands, not bodies, just hands, all facing upward, as if reaching for light that would never come. When Anand woke, his pillow was damp with ash. The temple grew quieter in the following days. Monks fell ill, not from sickness, but from stillness. They stopped speaking. Some refused food. One wept during morning prayer but could not explain why. Another sat in meditation and did not rise for 2 days. And through it all, the chanting continued. Always faint, always distant, but always hers. On the 7th night, Anand returned to the stupa alone. He brought a single candle, a bowl of water, and the cracked urn he had hidden beneath his sleeping mat. Something in him knew this was not ritual. This was debt. He knelt before the door. He placed the urn on the ground, and as the candle flickered to life, he began to chant.
Not the safe verses, not the sutras taught in daylight. He chanted what she had whispered in his sleep. The words were foreign but familiar. They settled on his tongue like smoke and salt. And when he finished the first line, the door of the stupa creaked. Just an inch. Enough. He did not enter, not fully, but through the gap he saw her. She did not move, but her head turned, just slightly. The veil hung over her face like old mourning cloth. Her hands rested on her lap, bones wrapped in memory. She opened her mouth and whispered, "One chant before dawn." The door closed, not with violence, not with threat, but with ritual, a promise now sealed. When Anand returned to the prayer hall, he found Somchai waiting. The monk's eyes were red, not with tears, but with exhaustion, like someone who had not slept in a lifetime. "She's chosen you," he said. Anand nodded. Somchai lowered his head. "Then I have failed her again." Far away in the stupa, the bell inside rang once. No one heard it, except the dead and the one boy who was now bound to them.
The candle flickered low as Venerable Somchai poured tea into 2 chipped bowls. He did not speak for a long time. His hands moved slowly, with care, as if preparing the tea was part of a ritual older than speech. Anand sat across from him, still wrapped in the shadows of the stupa, his breath thin, his chest tight with questions. Finally, Somchai broke the silence. "Do you know what happens when a monk dies with an unbalanced vow?" Anand shook his head. The old monk stared into his tea as if searching for a reflection he had once known. "He does not return, but neither does he leave." Somchai's voice was quiet but steady. The story came not as confession, but as continuation, one verse in a chant that had never truly ended. He told Anand about the woman. Her name had been Arya Chandra, a woman not of the valley, but from the lowland river town where the monsoons often carried more than rain. She had come to the temple with a bundle of cloth in her arms and despair behind her eyes. Inside the cloth had been the body of her stillborn child. No family, no prayers, no name. She had wandered for days before finding Wat Tam Sakorn, drawn not by faith, but by something quieter, grief that needed silence to breathe. The monks gave her food, shelter, no questions. But grief does not starve when fed. On the 3rd night, she hanged herself beneath the Bodhi tree. And as temple law dictated, her body could not be honored. No chanting, no rites, no cremation on temple grounds. The karma of self-harm, they said, must run its course. But Somchai had been younger then. He had believed love could redeem karma. He had broken the law. He had chanted. Anand's hands trembled as he listened. Was she freed? Somchai looked up. Would you be here if she had been? He closed his eyes and whispered the truth. I chanted the forbidden sutra. I called upon the verse of severance, the one meant to cut the soul from the cycle. I begged the spirits of the air, the guardians of the 6 realms, the winds of Yama to show her mercy. But mercy given too soon is not mercy at all. When the body was set upon the pyre, the fire refused to catch. The wood burned around her, but not beneath her. Ashes formed in the air, but her flesh remained. 3 nights passed, 3 chants repeated, 3 failures. On the final night, Somchai fell to his knees and begged the stupa to open, to swallow her pain, to take what the world would not. It did. He sealed her remains within it, surrounded by bone wards and string talismans. He chanted until his voice broke, until the blood in his throat tasted like ink, until she stopped speaking in his dreams. But he had not been absolved. Somchai looked at Anand now with eyes that had seen too many midnights. "He has died 3 times," he said. Anand stared, uncertain whether the monk meant metaphor or something more. "My body lives, my voice chants, but my karma never reset." He touched his chest. "I walk through this life, but I do not belong to it." Anand whispered, "Then what am I to her?" Somchai looked toward the forest, where the stupa stood unseen in the distance. "She chose you because you heard her. You opened the chant with innocence. That is power." "But I didn't mean to." "No one ever means to unlock a curse," Somchai said, his voice suddenly sharp. "But once the chant begins, it cannot be swallowed. It must be completed." Anand felt a chill crawl across his skin. "What happens if I do?" The monk's voice softened again, almost like mourning. "She will pass, but something else will remain. The chant cannot disappear. It must live in someone." That night, Anand lit incense in the prayer hall. He chanted only the safe verses, the ones he had memorized, the ones that brought comfort. But every so often his mouth drifted toward a syllable he had not meant to say, a sound not taught by the temple, a vowel soaked in echo. His voice cracked, the incense curled, and behind the altar the urn whispered, "You are almost ready." The dreams grew darker. He saw Somchai's younger face, mouth open in chant, eyes streaming tears. Ariya Chandra floated above the ground, her hair billowing like wet cloth. Her mouth opened wider than it should, her fingers stretched to impossible lengths. She was not a demon. She was a mother who had never been buried properly, a soul not damned but denied. And in every dream she turned to Anand, not with anger, but with hunger, not for flesh, but for a voice strong enough to finish what had begun. Somchai became quieter each day. He no longer joined morning chant. He no longer walked beneath the Bodhi tree. He sat beneath the stupa's shadow, hands folded, lips unmoving. "I am nearing my 4th death," he whispered once. Anand knelt beside him. "What will happen when you die?" Somchai gave a small hollow laugh. "If the chant is unfinished, she will chant it herself." He looked at the boy, eyes rimmed in red. "And the world listens more closely to the dead than the living." Before dawn, Anand returned to the sealed urn in the prayer hall. The crack was wider now. The ashes had formed a spiral across the altar floor, like a finger had stirred them deliberately. He knelt, heart pounding, and in the silence a voice breathed, "You promised me peace, but now I must take it." He pressed his forehead to the ground. "What do you want from me?" The answer came in the sound of soft chanting, his own voice, from inside the urn, and then silence. But it was not empty, it was waiting. The morning bell rang, but no sound followed. It swung once,
then twice, swaying in the quiet air above the temple courtyard, but the bronze let out only a dull, breathless vibration, as if the sound had been swallowed before birth. Anand stood at the base of the bell tower, eyes fixed on it. His hands still clasped the rope. He had pulled it. He had heard nothing. At breakfast, the novices spoke in hushed tones. One said his mala beads had turned cold in the night, as if dipped in river water. Another claimed to have dreamed of the Bodhi tree, dead, leafless, weeping ash. A third could not chant the morning verse. His voice broke, not from fear, but from a heaviness in his throat, as if something was already chanting through him. The silence at the table spread like spilled oil. Even Venerable Somchai said nothing. He only looked toward the eastern path, toward the stupa. Later that afternoon, a senior monk was found motionless in the library. Not dead, not asleep, just still. His eyes were open, his lips were slightly parted, and his fingers were curled around an open scroll that had turned black along its edges. A layer of ash coated the floor beneath him. When they lifted the scroll, a single line had been burned into the wood beneath it. She has begun the chant herself. The temple grew colder, not with winter's chill, but with absence. Sound no longer lingered. Footsteps did not echo. The chant halls rang hollow, as if someone had taken the acoustics of the place and emptied them with a single breath. Even birds avoided the temple. The Bodhi tree dropped leaves, but no one saw them fall. They simply appeared, curled and blackened, scattered across the stone. That night, Anand sat in the central meditation hall, alone. He lit 5 incense sticks, one for each realm of rebirth. He recited the traditional chants by memory. But halfway through the Metta Sutta, his mouth changed course. The syllables that emerged were not his. They rolled out with rhythm, ancient and liquid, syllables he had never studied, lines that bent the air around them. The incense smoke began to curl in the opposite direction, toward him, and from the corner of the hall, a bell began to swing by itself. It moved gently, but no sound came. Only a shiver in the air, like a breath over still water. In the days that followed, the monks began disappearing from their routines. Some no longer spoke. Some no longer walked. One sat beneath the bell tower for 2 nights straight, eyes fixed upward, waiting for a ring that would never come. And still, every morning, the bell was pulled, by no one, and heard by none. Anand approached Somchai. The older monk had grown thinner. His eyes had begun to sink into his face, and his voice sounded like dry leaves pressed between pages. "She's not waiting anymore. She's chanting without us," Anand said. Somchai nodded. "Yes." "What happens when she finishes?" he asked. He looked away. "She won't." "Why not?" "Because she can't." He turned to face the boy, voice quieter now, almost like prayer. "She needs a voice not tied to karmic weight, not bound by broken vows. She needs yours." Anand's chest tightened. "And if I refuse?" Somchai closed his eyes. "Then the chant will echo in everything, bells that make no sound, mouths that speak no words, prayers that never reach the other side. He opened his eyes again, pale and tired. The silence will spread. Anand returned to the stupa that night. The door had shifted open by half an inch. Inside, he saw only shadow, but he felt her. A presence so thick that it coated the back of his throat, like ash, like memory. He did not step in. He only whispered, "If I chant, what do you become?" The voice came from inside the stone. "What I was meant to be." He trembled. "But what am I then?" The silence held. Then softly, a bell that rings beyond dawn. The next morning, Anand did not hear the bell, but he knew it had been rung. He woke with the sound in his lungs, like a memory he had never lived, vibrating in his ribs. He stepped outside. The leaves of the Bodhi tree had all turned black, and in the center of the courtyard, written in ash, was a single circle with 3 lines inside, an old symbol of impermanence. He turned. Somchai was standing by the door to the meditation hall. He held the cracked urn in his hands, and for the first time he saw the truth. The ash inside was still warm. Later, in the library, Anand searched the forbidden scrolls. One bore no title, only an ink-stained lotus, wilted and curled. Inside, he found the lines of the chant, but the final stanza had no script, only blank space, space waiting to be filled. He touched the parchment. His fingers came away smeared with soot, and in that moment he knew he had not learned the chant, it had remembered him. That night, no incense was lit, no mantras were spoken, only one voice moved through the temple, Anand's. Soft, steady, sacred. He chanted not to awaken, but to complete, to let the bell echo through silence once more. And inside the stupa, she listened, not as a ghost, but as a soul nearing the edge of release.
Anand began to see the gesture in his dreams before he knew what it meant. A hand rising through smoke, fingers folded not in prayer, but in severance. Not like the lotus, not like the wheel. This was different. This was ancient. It came to him slowly, as dreams tend to do when they are not really dreams at all. A curled thumb, a bent index finger pressed across the heart, the other fingers stretched skyward, yet trembling, as if holding the sky apart from the earth. He awoke, gasping. The position lingered in his hand, as though his bones remembered before his mind did. That morning, he told Somchai. The elder monk grew still, not fearful, but reverent. "You've seen it," Somchai said, his voice hushed. "The Viraga Mudra." Anand furrowed his brow. "It's not in any of the scriptures." Somchai nodded. It was erased. "Why?" The monk looked toward the east, where the stupa slept behind fog. "Because it is not meant to bring peace. It is meant to unmake." In the days of the old Sangha, before temples had walls, before mantras were written, there were monks who chanted not to connect, but to release. They bore the burden of those souls too heavy to pass, too soaked in karma to be reborn.
These monks were not praised, they were exiled. Because in completing the chant, they took on what the dead could not carry. They walked as bells, Somchai said, echoing long after the souls had gone. And the mudra? It was the seal, the final key. The body must mirror the chant. The gesture opens what the voice cannot. Anand swallowed. Have you used it? Somchai's silence was answer enough. That night, Anand knelt at the altar, his hands trembling. The chant came easily now, as if he had always known it, as if the syllables had lived beneath his tongue for years, waiting for the right moment to bloom. He closed his eyes, and his fingers moved. Thumb folded, index pressed across the heart, the other finger stretched skyward yet trembling, as if holding the sky apart from the earth. He awoke gasping. The position lingered in his hand, as though his bones remembered before his mind did. And the moment he formed it fully, the air in the temple shifted. The incense sticks snapped in half. The prayer bowls cracked. The candles blew out in unison, not with wind, but with breath. And then the bell rang. Not the bell in the tower, the other one. The one inside the stupa. 3 times. Soft. Final. Anand opened his eyes. She stood before him, Arya Chandra, veiled, still, ash clinging to her robes like snow refusing to melt. She did not speak. She only looked at his hands and nodded. Then she raised her own and mirrored the mudra. Together they held the shape of release. And in that moment, the temple groaned, as if something buried had finally exhaled. Somchai came to him at dawn. He walked slowly, his legs weak, as though each step cost him years. I felt it, he said, lowering himself beside Anand. The seal has opened. Anand nodded. She showed me the final verse. Somchai's eyes widened. Then it's almost done. But there was no joy in his voice, only sorrow. You must understand, the old monk said. This chant has no ending. It only moves. Moves? Somchai looked at him. It must live in someone. Later, in the library, Anand found a fragment of scroll tucked inside an old prayer fan. It contained only one line, written in what looked like soot and rainwater. He who completes the forbidden mudra becomes the mouth through which others pass. He stared at it, heart pounding. He was not chanting for her anymore. He was becoming the vessel through which she and others would speak. That night, he did not sleep. He sat before the stupa, the cracked urn beside him. He lit no candles, offered no incense. He simply waited. And she came, not walking, not gliding, but becoming. She stepped from the mist like memory pulled from silence. Her eyes held no malice, only release and sorrow. She knelt across from him. Together they held the shape of release, and as they chanted, no longer separately, but as one, the door of the stupa opened. No sound, no light, only a sudden absence, like air leaving a sealed room. and Arya Chandra was gone. In her place sat a bowl of ash, still warm, still whispering. Anand picked it up, held it close, and from the urn came a voice that was not hers. "We are not alone in waiting." Then silence. When he returned to the temple courtyard, the bell rang once more, audible, clear, echoing, for the first time in weeks, and Somchai, standing beneath the Bodhi tree, wept, not from grief, but from knowing that the chant had passed on, not ended, just passed on. The rain returned the next day, not heavy, just steady, thin lines of water tracing the stone paths between the prayer halls like old veins coming back to life. The Bodhi tree, once cloaked in ash, seemed to breathe again. Its blackened leaves had fallen. New ones, pale and trembling, began to bud from the ends of old branches. But Anand knew the peace was not complete, because the chanting had not stopped. It had only changed. It came now in whispers from places he could not see, the echo of syllables in cracked bowls, the rustle of verses in dry robes left out to air, and sometimes in the very walls of the temple itself, where the wind spoke in cadence. The voice that once belonged to Arya Chandra was gone, but another had taken its place, and Anand realized with a chill deep in his spine, she had never been alone. He went to Somchai at dusk, carrying the cracked urn in his hands. "She's gone," he said, "but someone else is here." Somchai, seated beneath the Bodhi tree, nodded slowly. "Yes," the old monk murmured, "the hungry have no name, only need." Anand sat beside him, the urn still warm. "Who are they?" "Those whose death was never met with prayer," Somchai said. "Those forgotten by the living, left uncremated, unoffered, unloved. They wander, waiting, and when one voice lifts them, they come closer." I swallowed. "Is that what I've done?" Somchai looked at him with tired eyes. "You opened your breath to them. Now they believe they have a vessel." That night, Anand returned to the meditation hall alone. He brought nothing with him, no candle, no incense, no mala beads, only silence. And in that silence, he heard the first cry. Not a chant, a cry. High, thin, cracked with grief. It came from beneath the floorboards, from behind the altar, from the edges of memory. "I died without a name. No one fed my soul. I starved in the space between prayers." Anand fell to his knees. The floor grew cold. The shadows deepened, and he felt it. A hunger that was not for food, not for fire, but for acknowledgement. In the ancient teachings there is a term, preta, the hungry ghost. Not a demon, but a soul twisted by longing. A spirit whose mouth is too small to swallow food, whose stomach is vast and empty, doomed to crave what it cannot receive because no one remembers to offer it. Anand now understood. Arya Chandra was only the first. She had stood nearest to the veil, but behind her were many. He lit incense the next morning and placed offerings around the temple, bowls of rice, cups of water, fragments of fruit. Wherever he felt the air grow heavy, he left something,
and in return the silence began to soften, not vanish, but settle, as if dozens of invisible hands had paused to cup the warmth. That evening he chanted aloud, but not the forbidden verses. He used the Tirokuda Kanda Sutta, the traditional chant for the departed. Outside the walls they stand, and at crossroads, returning to their old homes, they wait. But when an offering is made, they rejoice. And as he spoke, the air in the hall shifted. It felt full, for the first time, not with dread, but with presence. Still, there was one place where the offering bowl remained untouched, the far corner of the meditation hall, beneath the old drum. Anand approached it late at night, carrying a candle and a small bundle of rice wrapped in lotus leaves. He placed the bundle down gently, and just as he turned to leave, a voice whispered, not loud, not angry, but ancient, "I did not die in silence." He froze, turned, the candle dimmed, and he saw her. Not Aryachandra, someone older. Her hair was bound in the style of another century. Her robes were torn. One arm ended at the elbow. Her neck bore the faint blue line of strangulation. Her feet hovered just above the ground, toes curled like they remembered pain. She looked at him with hollow eyes. "Do you know how long I have waited?" He couldn't speak. She stepped closer. "Do you know how many of us are waiting?" And behind her, others appeared. Not fully, just shadows with eyes, mouths that opened but did not close, hands that trembled in the shape of prayer. Anand fell to his knees. "I don't know your names," he whispered. "Then feed our memory," they replied. "Chant for the nameless." At dawn, Somchai found him still kneeling. The offering bowl was empty, not spilled, just used. The rice was gone. The candle had melted completely, and Anand looked up with tears in his eyes. "They're everywhere," he said. "The unfed, the unchanted, the unspoken." Somchai placed a hand on his shoulder. "And you are now the mouth through which they rise." That day the temple changed its rhythm, not with ceremony, but with quiet intention. Every chant now included a verse for the forgotten. Every meal included a portion left in offering. And Anand began to chant not only at night, but in the in-between hours, at 3:13 a.m., at the hour when the veil thins and breath becomes prayer. But as peace spread within the temple, so did another truth. Anand was growing thinner, his voice lower, his hands colder. He was not dying, but he was no longer fully here. The chant had found a vessel, and it had begun to bloom.
There are sutras that praise, sutras that protect, sutras that release. But there is one sutra that does none of these, because it was never meant for the living, and never meant to be heard in full. It came to Anand in fragments. At first, only phrases he couldn't place, echoes that slipped between verses during his midnight chants. They came when the hall was empty and the incense had curled its last breath, when time slowed and space folded inwards. Then came the symbols, etched into the bottoms of offering bowls, hidden beneath layers of soot on the altar stones. Not ink, not paint, just the faint impression of letters, like something had breathed them there. One evening,
As the rain whispered through the courtyard, Anand found a forgotten scripture scroll tucked behind a loose panel in the prayer hall wall. It was small, wrapped in red cloth, faded by years of hiding. He unfolded it slowly. The parchment inside was brittle. It had the scent of old lacquer and sandalwood, but beneath that, something colder. The chant was written in Pali, but the script was strange, angular, urgent, as if the writer had carved the words with trembling fingers and fear in his throat. There were no verses of compassion, no stories of the Buddha's walk under the stars, only one long, unbroken stream of syllables, rhythmic, repetitive, heavy, like a heartbeat that had never stopped. At the very bottom, in a different hand, was a final warning. This is not a chant. This is a door. Somchai stared at the scroll in silence for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was dry as dust. I had hoped it was lost. Anand whispered, "What is it?" The monk traced the final line with his finger. The Anagata Vimutti, the Sutra of the Unborn Liberation. He looked at the boy. It is not a prayer to free a soul. It is a knife that cuts karma loose entirely. Anand frowned. Isn't that what release means? Somchai shook his head. True release comes through realization, through transcendence. But this is exile. It severs the thread completely. He looked away. No rebirth, no return, no echo. Anand couldn't stop thinking about it. That night he chanted as he always did, softly, steadily, his voice weaving through the darkened temple like incense through rafters. But his mind echoed with the forbidden verses. They didn't feel evil. They felt inevitable, as if they had waited for someone like him, someone who had been emptied by grief, someone who had been hollowed by silence, someone whose voice could become final. In the dream, he stood on the edge of a dry riverbed, ash instead of water, bones instead of stones. The sky above him swirled in endless gray. Across the bank stood 1,000 shadows. None had eyes, none had mouths, but they all faced him, waiting. In his hands, the scroll. In his mouth, the chant. He began, and as he did, the shadows turned, not away from him, but into him, one by one, until the riverbed was empty, and he was full. He awoke in cold sweat. The scroll sat beside his mat, untouched, but inside him the verses pulsed. They were no longer something he had read. They were something he carried. He brought the scroll to the stupa, knelt before the door, and whispered, "Is this what you wanted?" The air stilled. A voice answered, not Arya Chandra's, older, heavier, a man's voice, coarse and wind-worn. "We do not want, we wait. Chant it, and we cease. Chant it, and you are last." Anand stepped back. The scroll burned faintly in his hands, not with flame, but with heat, like it had been resting against memory too long. He looked to the Bodhi tree. Its new leaves had curled, as if afraid. He looked to the temple's walls. The stone had begun to darken, veins of black running like roots beneath the surface. He looked to his own skin. His fingertips were gray, as if the chant had already begun to turn him into ash. Some chai approached him at dawn. His breath was shallow, his spine hunched. He looked at Anand with the sadness of one who had tried and failed to hold back a tide. "I chanted it once," the monk said. "Not all of it, but enough." Anand's eyes widened. "That's why you never passed on." Some chai nodded. "I severed her karma, but I bound myself. I stopped her suffering, but I became her echo." His eyes filled with a strange light, part regret, part reverence. "If you finish it, you may save them all, but you will not remain." Anand whispered, "Then what do I become?" Some chai exhaled. A chant, a sutra, a bell. That evening, Anand walked the temple grounds alone. He placed his hand on the bell. It was cold again, but he could hear it vibrating, not with metal, but with memory, not with sound, but with chant. The sutra was ready, not for silence, but for completion. And somewhere beneath the stupa, the nameless began to kneel, ready not to rise, but to disappear.
The Bodhi tree is sacred not because it stands, but because it remembers. Every root drinks the prayers of the past, every leaf trembles with echoes of enlightenment, and every scar in its bark marks where silence once broke. But not all memories beneath the Bodhi tree lead to awakening. Some lead to ash. Long before Anand's time, long before even some choi's vow had been broken, there was another monk who chanted in secret. His name was lost, erased not in anger, but in fear. He had lived during the founding days of Wat Tham Sakorn, when the stupa had just been sealed and the stone paths were still being shaped by the souls of the devoted. The records say he was silent, kind, devoted, but too devoted. He had discovered the forbidden sutra in its full form, and unlike some chai, he had chanted it to the end, not for one soul, but for dozens. The story passed down like a shadow, spoken only once, then never again. He had grown obsessed with freeing the lingering dead from karmic suffering. Some say he wandered graveyards. Some say he listened at the doors of the dying, memorizing their names before they passed. Others said he stopped sleeping altogether. His voice became the sound of midnight itself, and with every chant, the temple grew quieter. Not peaceful, just emptier. One night, he gathered the final ashes of a condemned spirit, someone who had committed a ritual betrayal, an offense so grave no chant was ever to be spoken on her behalf. But he chanted anyway. He stood beneath the Bodhi tree. He lit no incense. He knelt on bare stone, and he began the Anagata Vimutti, line by line, syllable by syllable, until the tree's leaves began to turn black. By morning, the tree had burned, not with fire, but with heatless ash, its trunk hollowed, its roots smoldered. The birds had fled, the wind refused to return, the temple bell cracked that day, and the records show it was never replaced. When the monks found him, he was seated in the hollowed trunk, eyes closed, still breathing, but he never opened his eyes again. He was not dead, but not living. He had become part of the sutra, a monk-shaped verse, a living silence.
The tree was cut down, buried, the soil salted with tears. Another Bodhi tree was planted in its place decades later, but it never grew straight. Its branches always leaned slightly east, toward the stupa, as if remembering. Anand heard the story from Samshai the night after discovering the final verse. They sat together beneath the newer tree, where a thin garland of wilted flowers hung from a low branch. "It's not just a chant," Samshai whispered. "It's a pull." Anand didn't respond. He was watching the wind. It circled the Bodhi leaves, but never touched them, as though the tree knew, as though it feared being remembered too deeply. That night the leaves fell, all of them, not with a gust, not with rot, just fell, together. And in the temple bell tower, the rope unwound on its own and lowered itself to the ground. No one pulled it, but everyone felt it ring. The dreams returned. Anand walked through the memory of the first burning. He saw the monk whose name was lost kneel inside the hollowed tree. He heard the chant echo through the branches like wind through bone. And he saw the faces of the spirits being pulled from the ground, dozens of them, rising like smoke, only to vanish in silence. But when he turned to the monk, there were no eyes in his face, only two hollow sockets from which ash poured endlessly, and in his lap, the scroll, still open, still warm, waiting for a new voice. Anand awoke with the taste of soot on his tongue. He stepped outside. The Bodhi tree was bare again, and beneath it the stone bore a fresh crack, thin, winding, splitting the center where offerings were once placed. It looked like a vein, or a fracture in time. Samshai stood nearby. He did not speak. He only bowed, deeply, to the stone, to the tree, to the memory of what chanting can do. Anand whispered, "If I finish the sutra, will it all disappear?" Samshai looked at him. "No," he said, "not disappear, but just leave no echo." Anand nodded. He was beginning to understand. Some prayers are not meant to free the dead. They are meant to remove them completely from time, from karma, from story. Not forgiveness, not salvation, just absence. That night, as the temple slept, Anand stepped barefoot to the old altar. He placed the scroll on stone, and he began to trace the final verse with his finger. His breath trembled. The walls of the hall pulsed. The floor beneath him grew warm. And outside, beneath the Bodhi tree, the wind began to circle again. But this time, it burned. The moon did not rise. No clouds, no stars. Just an empty sky stretched across the heavens like a sealed lid. The temple grounds lay still, steeped in a darkness that refused to be named. No insects chirped, no leaves rustled. Even the wind seemed to kneel, waiting. It was the kind of night monks prayed to pass through untouched. But this night had been promised, and it had finally come. Anand woke not from a dream, but from silence. Thick, heavy, absolute. He stepped out of his chamber barefoot, heart pulsing slowly, like a chant paused in mid-verse. The lanterns had gone out, all of them. The incense in the prayer hall had burned down to cold wax and bone-gray ash. He moved through the dark with a strange certainty, like his body knew the path before his mind had chosen it. Something was waiting, and it was no longer hiding. He found Somchai beneath the Bodhi tree. The elder monk sat on a stone mat, his robe folded neatly beside him, exposing the white linen beneath. Simple, ceremonial. Before him was a bowl of black sesame rice, a candle, and a strip of cloth, the death offering. Somchai did not look up, but he spoke. "The moon has refused to rise," he said softly. "She knows what tonight is." Anand stood beside him. "She's gone," he whispered. "Arya Chandra passed." Somchai nodded. "She was only the first to wake." He looked at Anand with sorrow, not fear. "This temple is a vessel, and it has grown full." All across the compound, the bells began to sway. No wind, no touch, just motion. But no sound came. Not until Anand stepped back toward the meditation hall and the first bell cracked. The sound echoed, not like chime, but like bone breaking underwater. Then came another, and another. The air thickened, the silence shattered, and through the breach they came. They did not crawl, they did not scream, they simply appeared. Figures in robes not worn in centuries, eyes veiled by dust, some missing mouths, others floating just above the stone paths, their feet never touching ground. One held a lotus that had rotted from the stem outward. All were hollow, not evil, just waiting. Anand fell to his knees as the shadows circled the prayer hall. Some whispered his name. Others chanted in languages he could not place, fragments of mantras from lifetimes ago. "You opened the seal," they said. "You chanted in hunger's name. Now we will rise, or you will fall." Inside the stupa, something shifted. The air turned warm, then blistering. Anand ran. He reached the sealed door just as a crack split down its center. From inside came a chant, low, familiar. His own voice, but layered, multiplied. 100 voices echoing back his words, twisted by grief, bent by longing. He pressed his palm to the door. It was beating, as if the stupa itself had grown a heart, and it was waking. He turned to find Somchai behind him. The monk now carried a clay bowl, filled with what looked like blood and ash mixed into a thick paste. "It is the final rite," Somchai said. Anand's breath caught. "For you?" The old monk shook his head. "For you." The offering was not for the dead. It was for the vessel, the one who would finish the sutra, the one who would wear silence like a second skin, the one who would chant even when the body had turned cold. Anand stepped back. "I'm not ready." Somchai's eyes filled with gentle grief. "You were ready the night you listened." Behind them, the shadows gathered, not threatening, just patient. They watched with empty eyes, a congregation of souls held between prayer and punishment. They needed release, but not through fire, not through words, but through continuity, through inheritance, through Anan. He took the bowl, smeared the ash across his chest in the shape of the Viraga Mudra, the gesture of severance. Then he turned toward the stupa and began to chant, not to summon, not to release, but to become. The veil broke, not with a scream, but with a breath. Time bent. The prayer hall split, and the sky, still moonless, began to spin. The dead knelt. The stupa opened, and Anan stepped inside. Inside was not a room. It was a memory of every chant ever forgotten, of every name never written, of every bowl never filled, of every bell that rang only once. He stood in the center. The scroll hovered before him, unwritten, expectant, and he, with voice trembling but certain, whispered the final line, the line that ends the chant, the line that ends time. And in doing so, the shadows bowed, the air stilled, and the stupa went quiet, forever. Outside, Somchai wept. He bowed to the stone and placed the final offering at the foot of the Bodhi tree. A single grain of black rice, a folded robe, a name written in ash, Anan.
The stupa closed behind him, not with a slam, not with a lock, but with the sound of air being held, like the breath of the world had been drawn in and never released. Anan stood alone in the dark, but he was not alone. The chamber was filled with presence, not shape, not voice, just presence. A waiting that hummed, a silence that leaned forward, a stillness that wanted to become sound. And Anan understood. This was not a tomb. It was a throat, and he was now its voice. The scroll hovered before him, though his hands did not hold it. Its final lines glowed faintly, drawn not in ink, but in something older, like soot mixed with starlight. Each syllable shimmered as though alive, as though it breathed. He began, softly. The first line came easily. It had lived inside him long enough. The second fell like a feather, the third like a stone. With each verse, his voice grew thinner, not weaker, just more distant, as if it were no longer coming from his throat, but from somewhere beneath the floor of the world. Outside the stupa, Somchai knelt alone before the Bodhi tree. He did not chant, he did not speak. He only bowed, again and again. Each time his forehead touched the earth, leaving behind a smudge of ash. He whispered, "May his voice reach where mine could not." And the wind carried nothing in reply, only stillness. Within the stupa, Anand's body trembled. His hands formed the Viraga Mudra, the final gesture, the seal. His knees buckled, but he remained upright. His mouth opened, and he spoke the next line, and the next, and with each a soul departed. He did not see them, but he felt them, passing through him like wind through dry reeds. Light, then gone. 1,000 of them, 1,000 who had waited with hollow mouths and outstretched hands, all fed, all released, all silent now. And then, the final line. It floated before him, unwritten. He closed his eyes, and in that darkness he saw Arya Chandra, not veiled, not haunted, just still. She bowed. So did the monk with no eyes. So did the child. So did the faceless ones, all of them, waiting for one final chant. Anand opened his mouth, and the last syllable slipped from him. It did not echo. It did not ring. It simply was, like the closing of a door in a room that no longer exists, and with it, his breath left him, not in pain, not in fear, just as a gift. At that moment, outside the stupa, the first light of dawn touched the edge of the temple. A thin line of gold spilled across the cracked stone. The bell rang once. Its echo stretched long and low, trembling through the forest, the valley, the bones of the temple. And then, silence, sacred, complete. The stupa door opened on its own. Somchai rose with difficulty. He stepped inside. Anand was kneeling, still, eyes closed, mouth soft, like he was listening to something too distant for the living to hear. His body was not cold. It was warm, as if mid-prayer. In his lap, the scroll had turned to ash, and the floor was clean, as if it had been swept by wind. Somchai did not cry. He bowed once, then folded the boy's robe, and left the stupa in silence. As he stepped into the morning, the sun rose fully over the valley for the first time in many weeks. The birds returned. The leaves of the Bodhi tree glistened with dew. And in the stillness of that new day, the temple exhaled. Anand was never buried. He was not cremated. He remained in the stupa, a vessel, a bell that no longer needed sound. And in the centuries that followed, no spirit ever returned to Wat Tam Sakhorn, because they all remembered the boy who chanted once before dawn and left nothing behind but peace. The morning sun rose, soft and golden, casting long shadows across the temple stones. The air felt lighter. Birdsong returned, and for a brief moment, Wat Tam Sakhorn seemed whole. But the temple was not yet free, because one final rite remained, and it could not be completed with incense alone. Somchai stood before the cremation pyre, hands folded, eyes lowered. Before him lay Anand's robe, neatly folded. Upon it, a small bowl of rice, 3 lotus petals, and the cracked mala beads once worn around the boy's wrist. There was no body, only silence where a soul had once breathed. But the rite had to be completed. Every monk who passes, even one who becomes more than monk, must be honored, or karma forgets, and forgetting is the beginning of haunting. The other monks gathered, quiet and still. Many had never spoken to Anand, but now they stood in reverence, in debt. He had emptied himself for them, for the temple, for the nameless, and now they would chant, not to release him, but to remember. Somchai lit the first flame beneath the kindling. The fire sputtered, crackled, then died. He tried again. This time with sacred oil dripped across dried palm leaves. The spark
caught. But again, the fire recoiled, as if the air itself would not consume what had already become part of eternity. The wind shifted, the flame dimmed, the wood remained cold. The monks looked to Somchai, but he knew. This was not a refusal. This was a message. Some things were not meant to burn. Some things were not meant to pass. They were meant to remain, not as flesh, not as ash, but as breath, carried by the temple itself. He turned from the unburned altar and made his way to the Bodhi tree. The leaves swayed gently above, casting dappled patterns across the stones. He knelt, removed his robe, folded it beside him, then opened a small pouch, inside black rice and salt. He placed them in a clay bowl, added a single drop of oil from Anand's unused lamp, then whispered the final confession. I chanted where I should not have. I opened what should have remained sealed. I believed compassion could erase karma. He lowered his head. But tonight I offer not apology, only balance. That night the wind grew sharp. The moon returned, a full circle of white hung above the stupa. The monks did not chant. They waited as the bell rang once, and the flames finally rose, but not from the pyre, from the stupa. It was not fire that destroyed. It was memory purging itself. Ash lifted into the sky, soft and glowing, like prayer turned into light. And within the stupa, the walls trembled, not from collapse, but from release. No screams, no voices, just one long final exhale from 1,000 souls. And when it ended, the sky was clear, the earth was warm, and the temple was quiet, truly quiet, for the first time in generations. By dawn, the stupa had sealed itself. No door, no crack, only smooth stone, like a scar that had healed completely. And on it, carved in faint, delicate script, the bell has rung, the chant has ended, all have passed. The monks continued their days in peace. Chants filled the halls again, not of fear, but of devotion. Offerings were made, leaves were swept, incense lit with steady hands, and no spirit ever stirred again, because no spirit remained. Only story, only echo, only gratitude. And Somchai, he was last seen beneath the Bodhi tree at sunset, eyes closed, hands folded, mouth curved into the faintest smile. Some say he faded, others say he walked into the fog and never returned. But those who still visit Wat Tham Sakorn say the wind sings near the stupa now, not with words, but with thank you, spoken in silence.
The sun rose, not suddenly, not in brilliance, but in gentleness, a slow unfolding of warmth across stone. Its light touched the very edge of the temple first, the eastern wall where moss had long claimed the cracks. Then it reached the steps, the prayer hall roof, the bell tower, and finally the Bodhi tree. Its branches held the light like memory, and beneath it the wind moved softly, carrying not words, but peace. No one spoke of that night anymore.
not because it was forgotten, but because it was complete. The monks continued their daily rituals, sweeping, offering, chanting, not out of fear, but reverence. The air no longer trembled, the shadows no longer lingered, and the stupa stood sealed, quiet, whole. A monument to the vow fulfilled, a wound that had closed without scar. The scroll of the forbidden chant was never found again. Not even ash remained. But sometimes, just before dawn, a single syllable would echo through the corridors. Not loud, not spectral, just a hum, as if the temple itself exhaled the memory of a voice it once carried. A voice that had chanted for the nameless. A voice that had sung the silence clean. A voice that had become stillness. Anand's name was never carved. No plaque, no ceremony, no relic. But every monk who passed through Watsakorn was taught to pause at the stupa, to bow not to a figure, but to a space, a silence, a moment. Because in that space, chant and ash had become one, and in that oneness, peace had rooted itself like a seed beneath the floor. The Bodhi tree blossomed again the next season. Its leaves no longer curled. They shimmered green and gold, brushing the wind like fingers across a sleeping child's cheek. Beneath it, offerings were made not to the dead, but to gratitude. And the bell, once silent, rang again each morning, not to summon the living, but to honor what had been surrendered. Somchai was gone. Some say he faded beneath the stupa's final breath. Others claimed he had stepped into the forest, robes folded, a chant in his throat, ready to meet what waited beyond rebirth. But one novice, a quiet boy, often awake before the others, once said he saw the elder monk standing at the temple's edge one morning, hands behind his back, watching the light spill over the mountains. And just before the sun rose fully, he vanished, as if swallowed by the very dawn he had prayed for. And so the temple lived on, in chant, in silence, in stories told only once, and then never again. But each time a monk whispered a blessing, or a bowl of rice was left beneath the Bodhi tree, or a bell rang with no rope, Anand lived again. Not in form, not in sound, but in space. The breath between mantras, the warmth in incense smoke, the pause before the final syllable. Because some souls do not pass on, they do not vanish. They become the stillness others return to, the quiet place between sorrow and release. And so, when the temple falls silent before dawn, and the bell rings once, all on its own, you will know he is still there, chanting softly, without voice, without name, only peace.